Awesome. Well, super excited to do this podcast. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Raj and Toli, I think, again, ultimately extremely impressed with what you guys have built with Solana, the team. I think where I would love to start ultimately with the podcast is maybe just reflecting a little bit. Solana has had a crazy past couple of years. Ultimately, you were born in the bear market and ultimately launched in the bear market. But I wanted to start maybe with some of your reflections from kind of when testnet went live, or I guess now mainnet beta, and then kind of some of the big learnings and lessons that you guys went through 2021.
Yeah, it's been like quite a journey. I think, I would say over the last 3 months, we've finally gotten, I feel like at the core engineering team, over this whole 2.5 years, that we're not fighting fires, that we're actually building stuff for the future. I think I would say from the first day of launching mainnet, we started calling it fire-driven development because there was basically a fire every day that was very important to fix as soon as possible. But I think recently, as folks have seen, performance on the network dramatically improve in terms of reliability and consistency. Validators have just been showing stats hey, look, everything is, you can literally see between 113 release and all the previous ones how smooth all the Grafana dashboards have gotten. So it really feels like we have an opportunity right now to start building and fixing problems that are forward thinking. It's if you've ever been a Linux developer, I think folks remember the 2.4 to 2.6 kernel transition. That was a very rough one. It kind of feels like that's what we went through.
Yeah, no, it's I would definitely echo the sentiments. I think ultimately now the industry more broadly continues to kind of suffer from different punches and blowbacks. But ultimately, I think it was definitely amazing to watch Solana's growth in kind of the 2021 period. Initially, kind of on the Solana pitch deck, it was blockchain at NASDAQ speed. And ultimately, I think what really transpired or really kind of found product market fit first was ultimately NFTs. Could you talk maybe a little bit about how you kind of envisioned the network growing and then how it actually unfolded?
Well, we thought that the most transaction heavy use cases are going to be machine driven and financial. And that's kind of thinking market makers and people participating in DeFi. These are going to be the number one users. And that actually turned out to be true. You look at even today, by raw aggregate amount of transactions, Pyth and Serum are the two dominant applications. One is an Oracle for financial data. The other one is a central limit order book for trading. So those take up the vast majority of the load, or create the vast majority of the load. But in terms of user numbers, NFTs kind of exploded out of nowhere. We really didn't anticipate that at all. But I've always had an open mind. I think internally we thought, okay, this central limit order book use case is the hardest one. That's the hardest one to build. Yeah. And it needs to be really, really good to be competitive with CME and NYSE and NASDAQ. And if we can get even remotely close, the technology is going to be good for everything else. It's going to be awesome for any kind of Web3 use cases. So that was really kind of our thesis. And I think that one worked out pretty well. I think we were right on the money there.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two phases there. And actually before DeFi existed on Solana, I think the first things that that people saw that would have pointed to the idea of product market fit was just teams like Kin that had already tried, scaling up on Ethereum, and Kin was on Stellar, and then they had a private fork of Stellar, and then when they thought about their like 5 million users and what they would do if it 5x or 10x, they pretty quickly realized like they needed something more scalable and decided to move over. And then I think the central limit order book primitive and the DeFi ecosystem happened really fast, and that all got kicked off more or less by Serum. And that was really just a few months after mainnet went live, after we were demoing Break and had shown that the network had stabilized. But I think both in Solana and in Ethereum, just across crypto, there seemed to be a ceiling of just how many users concurrently would be daily users and active consumers of new DeFi primitives, and it looked like tens of thousands. But I think it was like summer of 2021, so just over a year ago. It feels like 10 years ago that Degen Ape Academy launched on Solana after Metaplex.
Yeah.
And that was the first time we saw like, a couple 100,000 users concurrently and having the time of their lives trying to access that mint. And that was like a new phase of product market fit, where it was a completely different asset class, totally different style of users. And I think the expectation within maybe like a couple months would be maybe we would, expand beyond profile photos, and there would be music NFTs and video NFTs, and they would all be composable, and you could have like video game assets for characters and weapons, and that it would evolve quickly. I think the surprise has been that PFPs have been so resilient as like an asset class, and that they would be the organizing principle for communities to just organize together and find each other and resonate over art styles and refer back to the cultural evolution before them, and that Solana would have its own cultural kind of like split off from Ethereum that feels and looks very different. I don't think any of us expected that like 7.5 million users would have wallets with NFTs in them, and that's how they would view the assets. But I think like what was interesting too is that also stress tested the network in very different ways, right? Like almost all the outages resulted from hotspots that come from NFT mints that that wouldn't have been predicted if we were just building for DeFi all along. But now the network is very robust, and I think what we've just had is like the community got stress tested, and the resilience of why the blockchain exists has been stress tested. So it all feels like eras and phases that I'm sure will be fodder for different chapters of the book at some point. But it's all a fun story.
No, I definitely agree. And ultimately, you mentioned a couple of things in there. I think first, I remember watching some podcasts with Anatoly in the past talking about creating a new virtual machine and ultimately being different from the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, and how initially you guys kind of viewed that as negative. But now I think it's really has turned in, as you mentioned, to its own culture and being highlighted by Solana's own community, and seeing that proliferate over last year and this year, and now being stress tested. But it's amazing to see that culture did grow and has its own vibrance, which is very exciting. One thing that I think people often kind of confuse as well is from just because Solana is so fast and low cost, it did get stress tests to the limits. Could you talk a little bit more about the limits that Solana hit and why it was so much of a challenge, and maybe even compare that into some of the loads to these other networks, because Solana has really been pushed to its core, and I think these other networks, they did get pushed, but definitely not as much as Solana.
There's a lot of challenges in speeding up how blockchain works, and when you start with something like Ethereum or Bitcoin, you have a very resilient design that's very slow, and it's optimized for resiliency and not performance. And then you're trying to squeeze out maximum performance without sacrificing any of the designs that are built around that original kind of vision. And there's two kind of interesting pieces there. One is that you have like a mempool, which shares the transaction state. It's lossy. It's eventually consistent. It doesn't guarantee that transactions are visible by every block producer in the network, but effectively that's kind of what it does. And before a transaction gets packed into a block, there's this kind of very safe and robust but somewhat slow protocol to propagating them to everyone that could potentially be a block producer. And that prevents a flood of data. Like while it guarantees resiliency, what it doesn't do is allow for a very large amount of transactions to be evaluated at the same time and packed into a block. And that's actually impacts performance. I mean, it should be kind of obvious at a very gut level, intuitive level, that if you have a very slow process to propose things, it's going to be very hard to propose many things at the same time per second. So that's a very fundamental difference. And why Solana can't do these very fast confirmations and high throughput at the same time, a large part of that is because we don't have a mempool. We kind of operate at a different layer where we have, instead of a mempool, we have transaction flows. You do flow control, which is very similar to how most Web2 services operate. They don't typically do these sharing events with all servers on the network. They control the flow of traffic and then try to classify the traffic and separate it and make sure that none of it exceeds the predefined limits. So those are the two major kind of differences. So initially we saw the first time we had an outage, and we saw about 400,000 transactions per second being submitted to a single block producer. That sounds like a lot. That's actually not that many requests per second for a modern hardware. But because it was handling these events in these queues that were starting to get saturated, some of them started growing out of memory and eventually ran the systems out of memory and crashed. And there's a lot of these queues that go from getting a message from the network card and then checking if we've seen this duplicate message, then verifying the signatures, then checking if the message is valid and checking is it correctly structured, can the fee pair actually afford it, and then executing it, making sure that it actually works and does the right thing, and then packing into a block. Each one of these steps is, think of it as a separate queue in this pipeline, and you want to do these steps as fast as you can, and you're trying to do the fastest steps first, the cheapest and fastest ones first, because you're trying to whittle down the amount of invalid traffic that gets to the final step, which is let's actually execute it and pack into a block. So at 400,000, I forget which queue was the one that was bad that time. One of the queues blew up.
And just for reference, other blockchains, or Ethereum specifically, is doing what, 13 transactions per second?
Well, this is kind of a separate part because Ethereum doesn't have this flow control system.
They do have the mempool. Okay.
Yeah, they have a mempool. So you could submit 400,000 requests into the mempool, but vast majority of them are going to get rejected.
Yep.
Because nodes are just simply not going to accept any more data from you. So in our case, the leader is very greedy. They're trying to maximize the amount of flow that they're receiving to kind of figure out what are the best transactions. And that was I think that was 4 Mbps or something like that. So that was just a bug where we had an unbounded queue. The second bug was at about 20, that was 1 or 2 Gbps. The second bug that we hit was about 20 gigabits per second.
That's a lot.
That was hitting a few, that went from 400,000 transactions per second being submitted to about 2 to 4 million transactions per second being submitted to a single validator. So the use cases for this is still, it wasn't DeFi. The irony is that while DeFi generates the most orders and transactions, people write pretty decent bots and they know how to like control their own traffic. They don't just spam the network. For NFT mints, I guess people were just as eager and aggressive as possible to get these NFTs. So they kept, I think people literally built like botnets to go submit these, because the attack after that one was like hit 100 gigabits at a couple nodes. Mm-hmm. And Bitfinex called it a DDoS, and like some of the data centers actually flagged it as a potential DDoS attack.
Wow.
And the cool thing is that like a bunch of the nodes that had beefier hardware actually survived. So you had like more sophisticated setups that were running like, you know, 2 CPU based Xeon systems with like super fast IO and like a ton of memory. Those were able to drop that traffic, you know, fast enough and limit how much memory was being growing. But some of the weaker, like a bunch of the weaker systems and more than a third of the stake running on those weaker systems, once they got overwhelmed, they got knocked down. So we had to, while all this was happening, we kind of knew what the solution was. And it's a multi-part solution. You really need to limit the ability for all these bots to submit unlimited traffic to begin with. So we had to switch from UDP, which is a protocol used in a lot of finance. Like when you typically talk to an exchange, like NASDAQ or NYSE or CME, use UDP. So we had to switch from UDP to Quick, which is also UDP based, but it's a modern day internet protocol built by Google. It's like over a decade old, that has flow control. So we can tell the sender to stop, and they have to stop or they get dropped. Their connections or all their data start getting dropped at like servers upstream, at switches upstream. So that was one thing. Then we had to start managing the flow of data that's coming in. So you can't have like unstaked botnets that create a whole bunch of small Sybil nodes that all send 1,000 transactions each.
Yep.
Like, so you don't want to give somebody an incentive to create 1,000 small nodes that all spam you a little bit at a time, because it creates the same effects. So that was the quality of service stake weighted thing that we added. And the third thing was that you really want to disincentivize people from sending the same transaction twice, or even if they don't do it naively and simply copy it and send it twice, but they tweak some value in the message to generate a second message and send the exact same bit for a mint, just with some randomization there. What we want them to do is instead to pay more to the network to jump ahead to the front of the queue and to be first. So that was the prioritization scheme.
So ultimately, you implemented kind of these fixes. Solana has ultimately experienced those kind of multiple downtimes. Going forward, I guess, for kind of the non-technical people, are these the fixes that are needed to keep Solana like up?
Yeah, for the most part, against these kinds of attacks where you're being overwhelmed with data, those are the fixes that you need. So I think the design is robust, and we kind of saw it work during the FTX meltdown. That part I'm confident in, but there's other parts that could cause Solana to halt. Like, it's designed to be a system that picks safety over liveness. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it's a parallel runtime, which are very hard to build to begin with. Like, where you want to execute multiple things at the same time. And in a blockchain, in a web service like Facebook, if you have non-determinism, something executes first or second. Maybe a user A sees 200 likes in a message, somebody else sees 150 likes, right, on Twitter, right, or whatever on Facebook. It's not a big deal. Yeah. That kind of inconsistency doesn't really matter, and maybe eventually gets reconciled and resolved and repaired later. So stuff like that is fine for Twitter, but that's catastrophic for a financial system. It has to be both parallel and deterministic. And there's a lot of safety features that we added to the runtime that, like, it executes the transaction. Every machine executes them randomly. So you don't know the order what machine is going to execute. the virtual machine itself is actually encrypted locally. So any state that gets read and written is encrypted. So if there's a VM escape, that the data that that escape attack reads is going to be different on every computer. So all of those things would force the network to diverge and halt and just give up. Hey, something went wrong. I don't know. And nobody can agree on the final state. So the network stops. So those kinds of bugs are hopefully extremely rare, but there's no way to write a proof that they don't exist. But what makes me confident is that efforts like Firedancer, where there's a second implementation of a Solana client, will make it much less likely that the exact same bug exists in both clients. When you have a failure in one, the other one can recover and continue.
I definitely want to talk about Firedancer down the line. I want to kind of recap ultimately 2021. I mean, so you guys had this crazy year, way more, I would say, growth, maybe than you expected, or it was definitely parabolic. Network got stress tested a lot, ultimately did go down a few times with kind of the updates to the network that you've outlined. You're very confident in kind of the downtime being minimized. But for those that maybe kind of continue to point out a critique, like Solana has gone down, what would your answer be to them going forward?
Well, I think there's kind of there's different kinds of users that I think are really important in the ecosystem. I think for a lot of the NFT use cases, the downtime was just an inconvenience. So you couldn't do a mint at that time. You had to delay. And that sucks, but it's not catastrophic. I think for DeFi, these are the much harder conversations that you need to have.
Yep.
And there you have these really, really hard trade-offs. There's just no way to build the kind of stuff you can do on Solana and other chains. You need central limit order books. You need low latency, confirmation times and very, very cheap transactions to build these things. And if you go somewhere else, you're really trading off the innovation of that particular model for not being able to differentiate on tech at all, right? Because now you're stuck building slow systems and all those designs converge on a certain thing. So those are the trade-offs. And I think developers make those internally and kind of pick and choose. But we've seen the devs that build on Solana really believe in everything that the community is building and the core engineers that are making the network better and better. And they have they're the engineers that understand the risks and they see the network improving and they're able to make that decision and feel confident that the probability of something happening gets lower and lower with every day and with every release.
Perfect. I think I would add any other proof of stake blockchains that have real usage have had outages too, but you just don't hear about them much. I think, for a couple of reasons. One is you don't have as many vocal, passionate users that are using those blockchains that, that go and complain on Twitter. And then two is I think, Solana through 2021, through 2022, has the most diversity of developers, use cases. It's clearly shown the highest throughput by orders of magnitude. It's the chain to beat as far as next generation chains with much higher throughput that have a chance of scaling to billions of users. And I think the scrutiny and the level of I think kind of memes that folks choose to propagate to point out any flaws in the chain is just super intense. I think and we haven't done as much of a good job of combating that with all the positive narratives of everything that's happening on the chain. And so that's why I think podcasts like yours and the work that you and Diego do and other folks who stepped up after Breakpoint to just tell those stories of what's getting built, what communities exist here, the types of products and experiences that couldn't exist elsewhere, and why it's worth pushing through some of these performance hiccups. Those stories are super important, and I think Solana ecosystem has just gotten really good at doing that. So yeah, I think that's a really big focus for the next year. The other thing I'll say is like, I think we've always been looking at like the user numbers, the developer numbers around these outages. Like it doesn't really affect retention, but what does affect retention is that perception problem. Where everyone constantly has to explain like, it's not just the chain that goes down. There's a lot of other things about it that make it worth building on. And I think we kind of hit a breaking point like in the second half of this year where like important decision makers only knew about the outages. They didn't know about the data propagation metric that you guys point to. They didn't know about the throughput. They didn't know how robust it is and how much has been built on it. And I think it's kind of like if Ethereum was only ever known for the DAO hack.
Yeah.
Like, there's some element of that trial and tribulation that you have to go through as a chain to build resiliency. But there's also like a need for everyone in the community to tell the stories of what else, is happening on that chain and not just let it be a one note reputation.
Yeah.
I think we're moving past that for what it's worth. I mean, even in the volatility of the FTX collapse, like, all these problems existed in that time, right? There were huge liquidation events, and there was a ton of market volatility, and DeFi volume was like 6x what it was the day before, and the chain was just moving along smoothly. So I think it's probably going to be a 2022 narrative, and then in 2023 there's going to be more stories of just what's being built on chain.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think you brought up a lot of great points there. Ultimately, Solana kind of being this next generation chain. And this is ultimately one of the community questions that I asked this morning. Like, what do you feel or wish everybody understood about Solana, even maybe including power users, that is like a big misconception? Maybe on like the next generation stuff, like why high throughput is important, or some of the user metrics adoptions, because I definitely agree, Raj. I think there's a lot of misinformation. What are some of the biggest things that you feel like people, even maybe in the Solana community, misunderstand?
I would say like the biggest thing that annoys me is people that just say that it's not decentralized without really understanding what they're even saying. I think that's like the biggest annoyance. I think what people need to understand is that like decentralization is very important, that the network and every optimization that we're doing is with decentralization in mind first. And that really starts at the core layer one design is based on the idea that if we optimize the software to take advantage of hardware, then when people need more access to the network by adding more nodes, they need more validation, that they're not limited by like a subcommittee limit or some other limits, that they actually can scale it to whatever the world's demand. Like if the world really needs 50,000 validators to all observe the Solana state, we can support that. It's just a matter of hardware and software optimizations. And that doesn't require changing the design. It doesn't require increasing the fees for everyone. That's kind of the core part here. So the only difference between this vision, between what Solana is building and what Ethereum is building, is this idea of the cost of the hardware. That's about it. And my argument has always been that if you can get the problem to be a hardware cost problem, then you've kind of done. Because if it's, let's say it's 8 times too expensive, that's like, how many years is that going to take? 6 years before Moore's law and TSMC and everyone else like reduces the cost to where it's negligible. That's kind of like the huge advantage of being dependent on probably the best, most optimized industry in the world. It's just how fast people can ship upgrades to the computers that we use on a day-to-day basis.
And so
I think there's also somehow, I mean, and this is really like, enthusiasts who are not super technical, not really paying attention, but they matter, right? A lot of them are choosing which blockchains to use or pay attention to. They somehow think that because validators were able to communicate enough together to initiate a restart, that means they're more centralized than other chains, or that it's like one person that's flipping the switch, which is just ridiculous, obviously.
And like the whole point of these systems, right, that are based in cryptography is that with cryptography, we can actually scale very complex decisions to a very large number of users around the world. That's kind of the whole idea, right? Like the validators are not trusting each other or trusting some snapshot. Everyone has their local ledger state. They verify that they all generate the exact same snapshot. And if somebody starts generating incorrect snapshots, they actually debug it and figure out, is your ledger incorrect and stuff like that, and repair it. And like all that process is based on not trusting anyone else, but only trusting your own data and being able to verify that. So that part's pretty, there's like a lot of small misconceptions like that I think people don't dig into the details. Like the fact that the validators are able to restart on their own and like continue the network, that's a measure of resiliency, because no matter what you do, there's no way for you to like be robust against internet cables being cut.
Yeah.
Like there's in a global internet, right, that lives in this world where there's major world powers that at some point could decide that they need to bifurcate the internet, right, without real any notice. Stuff like that can happen, and you need systems that can recover the state and continue it in those events.
I fully agree. I mean, ultimately, and I think, Raj, you said this earlier, the narrative has kind of been spun a little bit. And I think, in my point of view, Solana's design is actually more simplistic in some regards than Ethereum. But what Ethereum has specifically done, I think, very well is pushing, or at least telling their story and their narrative. Going forward for 2023, what, in your point of view, would be a good narrative or a story for the Solana community to kind of tell to help kind of fight some of the misinformation that's being put out there?
I think one thing that at least resonates with me is that Solana is as cheap in terms of hardware as possible for the thing that it's trying to achieve. And that vision is very different from Ethereum. Like if you need settlement guarantees and you don't really care about the time or anything or the execution, you can use Ethereum. But that's not going to provide you like a free open financial system. Most of the money that TradeFire makes is not in settlement. Like the settlement houses are like the last step and the most boring step, and there's very little margin there. You make almost nothing like doing settlement. Like everything else is an execution, and execution depends on the really, really hard problems that you have to deal with decentralized sequencing and propagating information, not delaying that, like, a small group of users can observe all the trades before everyone else and take advantage of that information asymmetry and make all the money, all the MAV. Those problems are really, really hard to tackle. And the way we've designed Solana is to propagate information as fast as physics allow. At its final form, state transitions are going to move through the network at the speed of light through fiber as fast as news. There's no information asymmetry between anyone in the world. That means that like every hobbyist in the world that can connect to the network is on the same level playing field as jump trading or like the biggest market makers in the world. There's no like single sequencer or like whatever that you need to rely on. For a lot of these layer 2 solutions, you end up having to make compromises there in that execution environment to deal with the slow settlement like interfaces to Ethereum. And this is something that's very important to me. And like one of the motivations for me even like working on Solana was that prior to starting Solana, my hobby was just like trading on like interactive brokers on Onata and a bunch of these like small sites as a hobbyist. And every time I thought I had like a clever idea, my orders would get delayed and somebody would get in front of me, or like the data that I was receiving would be a little too slow and I couldn't submit fast enough. It always felt like I could never win. Right.
Yeah.
So it's very, very like actually like important to have a totally globally decentralized execution engine. And the way we're building it is the cheapest way to do it. We're not like just throwing money at out the window by making the hardware more expensive. We're actually trying to minimize the cost of that, and that's very much like a very true to the decentralization vision.
Yeah, I think like Chris Berniski has kind of tried to boil it down to, consensus at light speed. And he's talked about, Cosmos as the epitome, like the Platonic ideal of the app chain thesis, and Solana as the Platonic ideal of the monolithic high throughput, monochain thesis. And then Ethereum is sort of somewhere in between, and Bitcoin is store of value. And I think, that starts to encapsulate it well. I think you guys have the great chart on data propagation and just how far Solana is on that metric. And that starts to tell the story well. But I think like the core problem, and this is just going to continue to be the case for Solana, because, I think we're already on track to forever be the fastest, cheapest, most scalable network. Like if you use it, you'll see that it is just faster, it's just cheaper, and it's always the same network. You don't have to bridge across, these different layer twos and things. But the core problem is it always sounds too good to be true.
Yeah.
And people just assume that there's something wrong.
That we're cheating somewhere. And the only way that I've reliably seen people get convinced is if they talk to someone who's actually built on multiple networks, and it is actually building on Solana, and ask them like, what was your research? How did you decide on this? How do you think about it?
Yeah.
And I think that number is only going to go up, right? Of people who've actually interacted with, built on these networks. I think Audius was like the first good example that I remember where, they had built on POA on Ethereum. The use case needed decentralization. They need for there to genuinely be like a really difficult path to censoring transactions, because musicians, users, curators all were depending on this, the state of this program. And they, had users. They already had like hundreds of thousands of users, and they needed to make a choice. Like, do we go to a layer 2? Do we switch to a different layer 1? And nobody wants to make that switch more than once, right?
Yeah.
Helium went through the same journey. These types of folks have, teams of engineers that go through, proofs of concept on at least 10 different networks. And when a team goes through that kind of, technical research, and it's primarily a tech choice from the engineering team, not a choice from, BD or somebody in the C-suite that's just like reading headlines, the choice is always Solana. And I think, I kind of expected that maybe that kind of product market fit with those decision makers would start to have a snowball effect in a more substantive way than it has. I think the problem is the markets have, come and gone, and we're in a point of the market cycle now where like, it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 users or 1 million users. The market really cares about headlines and partnerships and logos. But I think that's not a winning strategy in the long term. And so I think like in the next year, whether it's consensus at light speed or 100 gigabit data propagation, the memes have to like come from a place of builders that are, that are sorting out the message that they know to be true, that can propagate to, to regular people that aren't paying that much attention.
No, I totally agree. I mean, ultimately, to your point, it's so fast, it's so cheap, and ultimately even cheaper than layer 2s. People are like, how is this possible? And it's funny, or in some sense, I really enjoyed my conversation and my podcast in the past, kind of doing a technical deep dive with Anatoly. But I have people come up to me that are in prominent, I'd say, Web 2 companies in Silicon Valley that still have a hard time kind of digesting this. And so I guess, so it is, I do agree. Ultimately, I do think the technology will push us forward. But, and as you kind of mentioned, a lot of it today is driven by headlines, especially partnerships. How is kind of Solana's foundation viewing some of partnerships more holistically? Because I think, today the narrative is partnerships versus like just continuing to educate people and builders about the underlying tech and scaling.
Well, I think to start with, I'll just say we've never really prioritized the idea of a partnership that sounds good, that has a press release that is like hypey, and that doesn't have a product team behind it to execute and iterate, because crypto is still very early stage, and the idea of product market fit that's repeatable and scalable to millions of users is just still, we don't know how long it's going to take to reach that. You need product teams that are, that are actively owning the integration and care with their core business metrics. They care about the success of using block space for something brand new. And that's actually really hard to find. What's easy to find is, mid-level, non-technical decision makers that want to run a pilot, but don't have the budget to run the pilot. And if you give them, $10 million or $20 million, they'll have their budget covered. It's an easy decision for their boss. And then they can go run that pilot that they've been interested in doing. And they get a nice, Web3 bullet on their resume. Like that is, I hope that there are experiments that get run through that process that, that uncover user behaviors with these large user bases that become, something really scalable and really valuable for Web3. But it's, that any chain can do that, right? Any chain can run those pilots. What we tend to look for is, what's the team that knows they have something core to their business model that they're really eager to scale up to, hundreds of millions of users. It tends to be something that's very disruptive to their own product or their own business model. So, you tend to have people that are high up, technical decision makers that view blockchain as a core piece of infrastructure for themselves, that go through that research that I described earlier. And by the time we talk to them, they've already made their decision, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a question of like, we want to shop around for grant money. It's a question of, we know Solana is the long-term choice. We've already started building. Our engineers have already kind of told us what they want to do with it. We have some questions. Can you help answer them? So that's where we tend to focus our time.
That totally makes sense. And I definitely trying to find those long-term builders is extremely important for people, I guess, that are either new to the ecosystem or really haven't done that research. Because I personally spent a year plus trying to figure all this stuff out, and ultimately extremely, extremely impressed by what you guys have built, and excited for ultimately this entire industry to scale and ultimately what Solana enables to do. Is there a way that we can condense that research or kind of thought process so others do not have to go through this? Or is it just going to be like a slow community building, kind of one by one type process where ultimately that will be reflected in metrics over time?
I think it's unfortunately like a slow process still. It took a very long time for people to kind of think of Linux as like, I need an operating system. What am I going to do? It's going to be like Linux or something like that. And that was like a very took a long amount of time for people to get there, especially at big companies that could build their own operating system. Same thing with databases. You kind of get through like anytime you have these complex systems, just the surface area for engineers is so large that when you're looking at a generic thing versus like, I have a very specific use case, we could just go implement it locally and it'll be awesome. Like these are hard trade-offs that every engineering team will make. And a lot of them internally want to build their own thing, like, cause they're engineers. So it makes a lot of sense. And it takes a long time for the industry to converge on something that works well for a lot of users and a lot of use cases.
Definitely makes sense. I guess ultimately, so trying to wrap up some of the FUD that Solana's experienced. Ultimately, 2021 was a crazy year in terms of growth. 2022 was kind of punches in the face for the entire industry. The last punch in the face kind of being FTX and kind of the fallout with Alameda. I want to touch upon this and then ultimately kind of move forward towards, as you mentioned, kind of the exciting things that are going on in the Solana community, especially with Firedancer. But what is kind of your message to the community and more broadly, people that are interested in building in the Solana ecosystem surrounding, or some of your thoughts surrounding what happened with FTX and say I'm in Alameda.
So like the crazy thing is that like the last year we've had more growth than the year before. Like people will just look at like the actual like number of builders and developers and like people that started building on Solana 21 to 22, like the conference literally almost doubled, like in the number of attendees. It went from like 2,000 to 3,600, which is like a huge jump during this massive bear market, right? Like the bear market already started at the start of this year. And despite all this, the number of like attendees grew. The number of developers that we've seen through hacker houses has been like astounding. It's been like tens of thousands easily. Like the last hackathon we had over 15,000 registrations, like over 1,000 teams like submitted a project, which is pretty wild. So all of that happened during this crappy bear market. And this punch in the face happened right at the last day of the conference, literally in the flight back with FTX. But I think looking back at like, especially this year, it's pretty obvious that like the community and the builders outgrew FTX already. Like the folks that when we did interviews about like which teams were like impacted by the financial fallout from FTX, less than 4% said that they had like funds on FTX International. Very small number of them actually had investments from FTX. Over 80, like close to 80%. I think the surveys online was done by an independent party. They asked like over 100 teams. Like close to 80% just had no connections to FTX at all. So you kind of already saw this transition happening. And yeah, this punch in the face was hard because like, you know, we expected FTX to be like one of the folks that are going to continue building and like integrating and like being one of the forward thinking like folks in the ecosystem. Like my initial vision for like Serum and like why I thought it was such an awesome thing to work with them was that they're going to disrupt themselves. They're going to build an awesome central limit order book that's fully transparent. There's no way for user funds to ever be at risk, right, inside Serum. And that would be a very disruptive engine for finance. But that's not how things worked out. But over the last year, you already saw an ecosystem of teams that were totally independent. And like within 24 hours of the FTX shit show, people forked Serum. There is now an open book DEX was rebuilt by the community that was using Serum, like the actual developers that were independent teams that needed that technology. They were able to fork it and continue. And independent market makers, these are hobbyists that are not like the big names that you hear about. Those are the folks that actually restarted the liquidity on it. It was a totally community driven effort. And every day it gets better and better. So like stuff like that, I think it sucks that this happened, right? Especially the way it happened. It just really felt like a punch to the face. Like, but I'm really like amazed by the community and the folks that are building on Solana, how quickly they were able to just recover and continue.
Yeah, no, I mean, in some comical sense, I mean, last year at Breakpoint was kind of marked the Pico top, and then this year hopefully marked the Pico bottom, I guess, with FTX. But no, it was amazing, as you said, to see the community kind of rally together, fork Serum, create a new project, and ultimately kind of push that forward. I guess to like the people that are not kind of as deep into the ecosystem, and I guess to me, in some sense, this is exciting for Solana because another critique that I constantly heard was Solana ultimately ended up as the venture capital chain. And with Alameda and kind of FTX being such a large part of some of that critique, now that being removed, I guess my question to both of you would be, what is your response or, what is your response to people that say Solana is kind of that VC chain or the FTX chain?
Well, I think perception really like lags reality. So I think it's been a while since I felt those claims held much credibility. We stopped raising money in June of 2021. I think that was the last time. And then, that was around the same time that like the NFT ecosystem on Solana became the main user acquisition channel. And I think that was also, if you look back to like Metaplex time, at that moment, Nifty Gateway was kind of capturing all of the inflows of users and funneling them towards these weekly auctions. And we thought about, supporting FTX in building an NFT exchange, and FTX was approaching us, and it was, there was a lot of demand from everyone in the industry to build something on Solana. And our approach was build on chain, build it open source, and empower creators, and solve for features that they needed, like royalty fee splits on chain. And that was really the last time that there was an opportunity for FTX to build something really meaningful and big on Solana, and they chose to really focus on their centralized exchange. So mid 2021 is over a year and a half ago. There's really been this independent ecosystem of creators, developers, users that Solana ecosystem is focused on, and FTX has kind of gone on its own since then. And still, I think as of the last month, there were these questions like, is everything on Solana being built by FTX? I think the perception is just really, really lagged reality. And then I think I'll also say there was a time when Ethereum, 10% of ETH was held by Joe Lubin. And there was this big question, like, what happens when he sells his ETH? And what happens if consensus, goes away or stops building? And I think, these chains have to go through these big crucible moments where a lot of that perception just falls away. And I think anybody that's looking at, Solana as a potential place to come build should see nothing but opportunity. Because when there's peak fear and the perception is at an all-time low, and that perception is lagging reality, and people think, the chain is in dire straits, that's often when all the best new businesses get built. That's where all the alpha is, all the opportunity. And I think what ends up stepping into that void is just this, it's like a hydra, right? Like inevitably it's impossible for one person or one organization to fill that void. It has to be like 10, because the ecosystem is 10 times as big as it was, a year ago. And even then it was 10 times the year before. So I think what we are already seeing is all the exchanges are like rapidly moving to see where's the opportunity in Solana, what teams can we fund, what assets can we support, what role can we play in this ecosystem. I think the same is true for builders. After Breakpoint, we saw so many voices of builders like the folks that coordinated around OpenBook, but also within the NFT ecosystem. And yeah, I think in the next year, what I expect to see is, 10 times as many strong voices and personalities and, leaders for the ecosystem that really guide its direction. And it's going to be partially through conflict, but that's what a healthy ecosystem looks like. Not everybody is supposed to agree.
No, I think you put that beautifully. Ultimately, just in the interest of time, I do want to kind of wrap up all this kind of FUD, kind of move on from it. So ultimately, just to summarize, I mean, Solana had a crazy year in 2021. Network got stress tests extremely hard. I would argue much more so than these other layer ones. Ultimately, that resulted in some downtimes. Those have since, multiple updates to the network have since been issued. Solana is essentially is designed for decentralization, and I think that FUD is also kind of being dispelled actively. Unfortunately, the stuff happened with FTX, but I think you kind of put it beautifully in different players stepping into the ecosystem and kind of pushing it forward. But now, in Solana's new narrative and kind of narrative creation, what I'm personally super excited about, and what honestly surprises me quite a bit, is when I talk with people in the industry, is still how they lack the knowledge around Firedancer and what Firedancer is and how it ultimately will contribute to the network. So maybe there's multiple things that Firedancer does, but maybe touching upon some of the high points and what you're personally excited about with Firedancer.
Yeah, this is something that I think is really, really important for the whole industry, just to see like what happens if a team that isn't like fighting fires at the same time as they're doing R&D is really focused on like, given a design that's designed for hardware, how do we actually maximize throughput across modern day hardware? And can we demonstrate that like the stuff that we think in theory is actually true? And this is probably the best team in the industry to go do that. It's the team that's done a bunch of the high frequency optimizations for jump trading. These are the folks that, if they need to, they'll build microwaves because speed of light through fiber is 0.7 C. Microwaves are travel faster by 30%. So they're that optimized and that nerdy. Like what Firedancer does is like when we started building Solana, our goal was to demonstrate that we can saturate 1 gigabit worth of throughput on through Turbine, like propagating data through Turbine.
And maybe just briefly touch upon like bandwidth, because I think this is another thing that people misunderstand, because it's core to kind of Solana and the Firedancer thesis.
Yeah. So like there's a bunch of different parts where bandwidth is constrained. We talked about earlier mempools and how Solana doesn't have a mempool and it has to shape all this traffic. So even if you have like 100 gigabits worth of traffic hitting a single node, like a leader, they have to filter all that for valid transactions. And right now, the usages on all modern day networks in crypto isn't that high. Like I think Solana does more transactions from applications alone per day than all the other chains combined. So if we went from like 300 TPS from apps that we do today to 700 TPS, that would be like everything. that literally is everything. So maybe 1,000 TPS worth of valid transactions out of literally millions of proposed per second. You end up whittling it down to 1,000. So that block, how fast you propagate that 1,000 is your data availability bandwidth. And we called it block propagation bandwidth. This was because this was way before the industry even like got consolidated to like understanding that data availability and block propagation is the most important problem for layer ones.
Yeah.
So we built this really highly optimized protocol called Turbine, and it's able to propagate information simultaneously to all network participants around the world at a very high rate. So if you have a demand for like 1 gigabit worth of transaction data, you need about twice as much for erasure codes and twice as much for fan out. So that's roughly, you need 4 gigabits worth of Turbine bandwidth. So our goal was to really demonstrate at 1 gigabit worth of Turbine bandwidth. So walking backwards, it's about 250 megabits worth of actual transaction data, or roughly we were seeing about 200,000 TPS on Google Cloud based like network where we have like no internet issues, right? You're running over like closed internet. Jump's goal is to demonstrate that at 10 gigabits. So they should be able to show 2.5 million TPS in a lab on a 10 gigabit network. And that's actually like, I think totally achievable on today's hardware. You don't need special switches. You just need like modern day CPUs and modern day motherboards with high PCI bandwidth and like high network and decent network equipment.
And ultimately, 10 gigabit just allows for insane amount of transactions per second, and ultimately, kind of more in layman terms, allowing developers to have a bigger sandbox to kind of play in and ideate, and then ultimately allow applications to scale.
But you need that many valid transactions. Like,
and today the demand's not there.
Yeah, that's like roughly 2 million TPS. And for them to all be valid at the same time, they have to be doing different stuff, right? They have to be parallelizable and doing different stuff. But in reality, what happens is that you have like an NFT mint, and you have a bunch of users and a bunch of bots all trying to get into the same NFT mint with 10,000 like items. The maximum number of users you can support there is 10,000, right? Like, and the NFT mint's going to run over a couple seconds. So like that's a few thousand TPS of demand in any given spike. So that's kind of like the vast difference between like the world and what the technology can achieve and the current demand. But what's awesome about Firedancer is that if they can demonstrate this, then like I think we can start really pushing like use cases that do need this. And this is like central limit order book style markets, but for a very long tail of like assets and things like that. Not only you're trading like spot markets like this, you're trading loans like in liquidations and like everything else in lending protocols. And the more throughput we have, the more little markets we can run and the more efficient the financial kind of infrastructure gets on chain. And that's, I think, a very, very exciting thing.
I definitely agree. And I think it's, I mean, so much misinformation about Solana, unfortunately. I think ultimately, over time, I definitely agree it will get dispelled, and happy to ultimately have this conversation, talk about a lot of the misconceptions, talk about really the exciting things coming up with Firedancer, and overall just kind of the network improving on uptime and even attracting kind of higher quality builders. I guess just in interest of time, what are some excited things, I guess, for 2023 that you're looking forward to, and we can kind of wrap it up there?
More Firedancer like demos. Like I think they're moving really quickly through the easy stuff, and I'm really excited when they get to like executing the ledger state. I think that would be awesome if we have two different versions of software built by two different teams that could all process the ledger and get to the same state result. That would be, I think, amazing. What I'm also excited about, I think, is like there is, I think, opportunities for bigger companies that have built up teams that are crypto teams, I think, to continue building and like really figure out not like pilots that they're trying to run to get like some points in marketing, but actually like transformative businesses where they change how they do like business. I think there's opportunity for that to happen, like maybe next year even. And that would be, I think, awesome. I think we're definitely ready for like a big retailer, I don't know, Target or Walmart, to like go on all in on stable coins and like save money on like spending a ton on like payments, right? Like stuff like that could happen and could really change the industry.
Raj, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, excited. Saga, the developer kits, thousands of them are sold out and shipping this month, actually. So I think we'll expect to see new applications to get built for mobile first, and user devices shipping in Q1. And then another big hackathon in Q1 as well. I think this is where, a lot of legends are going to be made, the people that show up in the depths of the bear market. And, every hackathon we've always seen new use cases, like more delightful, intuitive user experiences and new business models get built. So excited about that one. Definitely Firedancer. And then I think, we're seeing a lot of big companies that are building on Solana now. Google had a bunch of announcements at Breakpoint. Stripe, 11 out of 16 of their apps they launched with were Solana based. Today, Discord announced a big integration. So, and all these are like I described earlier, right? It was engineers from the ground up choosing Solana and building on it kind of mostly without our help. And I expect to see more of that in the next year as well.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for the time. Really, I mean, it's been amazing to watch Solana's growth and the ecosystem develop from the last couple of years, and look forward to the day where there's more builders, more users, and we can kind of go past all the FUD. But again, really appreciate your time, and again, thank you.
Thanks, Logan.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.